I have to say, genuinely, I'm very disappointed. I sound like Miriam O'Callaghan there, but I'm very disappointed that we're having this debate on a night like this with so few deputies in the Dáil to partake in it. And I'm going to make a proposal about that towards the end. But I say that because I do think it's really unfortunate, like Deputy Ryan said, that we're having this discussion before the publication of the report. And I think it's really unfortunate that it's kind of parked into the graveyard shift, or whatever they call this time of a Thursday night, because it is a very, very important issue. And I will make some proposals about that at the end. Just to repeat what others have said about the state we're in. We are the third highest producer of emissions per person in the European Union and ranked 49 out of 56 countries. Our climate policy, it seems to me, is to do nothing, to plead for special dispensations from the EU and to reduce any targets for emission reduction that we had aspired to. The Climate Advisory Council has already stated that we will not meet our 2020 targets, that the National Mitigation Plan will not result in decarbonisation, and that we face on current emissions fines in the region of €455 million or higher. Professor John Fitzgerald, who chairs the National Climate Change Advisory Council, it says the mitigation plan has many ideas for action but contains very few decisions. So we have official policy, various statements, lofty declarations, and we have inserted into various bills and legislations that commits us to emission reductions and decarbonisation of the economy. We seem to, on paper, recognise the seriousness of the issue, but then we have government inaction, effectively doing nothing to reduce emissions and to switch our society from being fossil fuel dependent to renewables. The much heralded Renewable Energy Support Scheme, when you unpick it, is really about big business and what big business needs. It contains rhetoric about community involvement, but it specifically excludes microgeneration and small community groups. Something I think all of us should acknowledge needs to happen if we are to have communities buy in to dealing with climate action, to overcome opposition and to make the kind of shifts that are needed away from fossil fuels. The fact that they're excluded tells us what is happening with our climate energy policy. We don't have one. The level of emissions rise and fall or not, depending on the policy and indeed the fluctuations in the market. We are not decarbonising. We are as dependent on fossil fuels as ever, and we are governed by the interest of the fossil fuel corporations as we've ever been. And here I want to say that I actually really genuinely think, the more I see of this place and talk to people, that Minister Naughton, to a large degree, and probably even yourself, Minister Ross, do feel you have a commitment to climate change, but I know that you would acknowledge that the power of the fossil fuel industry is greater than the power that you have as a minister, or indeed that Minister Naughton has as a minister, and that weighs down on all of the policy making of this government, the lobbying and the power of the big fossil fuel corporations and their addiction to profit. And it's not only Ireland that's not responding to the facts of climate change. The whole world is in the same boat. For all of our conferences, all of our bonds and our COPs, the grand affairs at the United Nations, the globe is now emitting a greater volume of CO2 into the atmosphere almost 30 years after Kyoto, decades after the science has been settled, and we knew with certainty what would happen if we pushed the parts per million concentrations in the atmosphere above 350 parts per million. We knew, and the scientific community knew, the consequences of this, and what are the results of those 3 lost decades? We now stand at over 400 parts per million. And those decades were lost in the fight against climate change. There was no fight. Instead, there was a denial industry for a long time, and the consensus was to use market mechanisms to deal with it. Carbon trading, offsets, bizarre schemes that suggested that if we in the West or in the industrialised countries were to continue to pump CO2 into the atmosphere, we could plant some trees in a developing country or have some schemes based on inventive or fraudulent accounting. Fraudulent accounting is what could be taken out of the atmosphere, and fraud as to what we were pumping into it. But all of these market mechanisms have failed, and while companies and countries can pretend that they're dealing with it, the facts have stacked up, Minister, and the levels of CO2 have risen to historic levels, higher than in the last 1 million years, and the extremes of weather have continued to break all records. We've had the warmest 16 years on record out of the last 17. The extent and the severity of droughts, heat waves and storm intensity have all gathered apace. It's in the face of all those who say this is an intractable problem, we want to make a practical suggestion, and we've already put a bill before the Dáil to address the question of the removal of fossil fuels from our shores. Now, it's brilliant that we had a fracking bill in the 26 counties, mind you. We have banned it, and we've banned the extraction of fossil fuels on land. But there was a refusal to take an amendment to that bill, which would also include offshore. So we're putting a bill to this House to include offshore. And I will repeat, and I've said this to Minister Naughton, it was hugely disappointing. It was almost like a kick in the teeth when, as soon as we went on summer holidays, he announced the issuing of a licence for further exploration in the Porcupine Basin. And there are, I believe, another 11 licences for exploration of fossil fuels, gases and oils off our coast waiting to be issued. Now, this simple measure, we were told by scientists in Bonn when we met with them, a simple measure, Ireland, a pithy little country and all as it is, if it was to achieve that, to ban the extraction of further fossil fuels offshore, would add greatly to the pressure on other countries and the industry generally around the globe. Because there are two other countries, France and, help me here, Eamon, what's the other country? A small country as well. France and Costa Rica, who are attempting to do the same. And between the three of us, if we managed to ban more extractions of fossil fuels, it would make a great contribution, because the science tells us that 80% of the already recognised and known fossil fuel reserves must stay in the ground if we are to tackle climate change. And to go digging for more would be an absolute catastrophe and would tie us in for another 40 or 50 years to fossil fuel addiction across Europe. So there's just one other additional issue that I want to raise here, and it's been brought to our attention repeatedly by the NGOs who others have already spoken about, the Stop Climate Chaos, Trócaire and the NGOs who are fighting the good fight to try and get us all to wake up and realise that we have a race for the future going on here. We are now in the process of building two large liquefied natural gas terminals on the west and on the south, to act as conduits for fracked gas from North America, possibly from the Alberta tar sands. They could end up being stored here and then being shipped over to or piped over to the rest of Europe, which would see the largest remaining reserve of CO2 on the planet being brought to the markets and the economies of Western Europe. It's madness. It's absolute insanity. And it sort of treats natural gas as some kind of a transitional gas. And interestingly, I had this conversation with Minister Naughton recently, and he acknowledged that the gas companies try to present themselves as green. That gas is green, you should use it, it's lovely. You even get the same sense from advertising and encouragement to use natural gas from the companies that run it in this country. There is nothing green about it. It is a fossil fuel. And the use of it and the use of the infrastructure that we're building around the coast will lock us in for another 30, 40, 50 years to a continued reliance on CO2, when it's exactly keeping fossil fuels in the ground is what we need to do. And just to comment on what Deputy Fitzmaurice said, no, maybe it was one of the deputies from Sinn Féin, about paying farmers and not to grow any more beef. That is also completely inaccurate, because the biggest beef farmers in this country, the likes of Goodman and Bruton, are the ones who are pushing for the major export deals with Saudi Arabia, with Egypt, with the Middle East. We are growing more cattle now to export live to those countries. Countries which never ate beef or dairy, which had a much healthier diet than we do, are now being encouraged to take this on, and we are growing that beef here, adding to our emissions. Our experience in Bonn was very interesting. I thought I would find it, you know, sort of a cynical exercise, but I learned hugely from it. And what I learned from it was, despite the emergence of thousands of companies which have very original and inventive ways of dealing with renewable energy, of promoting renewable energy, of extracting from air and sea and wind and all the rest of it, from solar power in particular, there are lots of companies there prepared to work with and sell and promote their products to tackle the question of climate chaos. But the problem is, the elephant in the room was never mentioned. It wasn't mentioned at our interparliamentary meeting. It wasn't mentioned when you discussed the question with all of the people with their stands. And the elephant in the room are the giant corporations of ExxonMobil, Shell, BP, all of the giant fossil fuel corporations across the globe who wield the power, who have the money, who actually control whole economies and countries and wield the power, and I believe really influence what happens in this state and in this country. So we do in this country have a crucial role in fighting climate change, and if we can achieve that one small measure of keeping it in the ground, then we can be seen as being the first to, like we were to promote a vote on gay marriage, we can be the first to promote the banning of further exploration. We could stop those liquefied natural gas terminals being built and promoted on our coast. We could revolutionise the unrolling of renewables, making sure that communities and micro-projects were encouraged to buy into the grid, and put those projects and those communities at the heart of our revolution and not big business. Because, Minister, I believe that the market is not the solution, it is the problem. And I just want to add, in terms of your own role as the Minister for Transport, I know I'm looking directly at you, Minister Ross, but your own role as the Minister for Transport in dealing with climate change also has to recognise that competition in the market for running buses and trains will not deal with the problem. We need public transport to be that, to be public, to be run in public interest, not in the interests of private companies who will compete with each other, who will tender for routes, but in the interests of the public. And by doing so, to increase our PSI and therefore to have a fully funded and growing and increasing and ever better public transport system that will take cars off the road and not pumping all our resources into building more and more motorways. That kind of spending would be a lot, I admit, but today we discussed at length the question of PESCO. And I'll just repeat it again, just for the sake of driving myself mad, if not the rest of us. Overnight, we can join a defence force in Europe that brings us from spending 900 million on our defence budget to between 3 and 4 billion. Overnight we seem to be able to do that. We've no problem signing it up to it. We're shoving it down the throats of deputies in this Dáil. This is the only way to go and we have to have that in. Where do we find that kind of money to spend on weapons of war and of destruction and weapons of death, instead of finding on something that could do something positive for the planet, like renewable energies, like bringing public transport up to scratch to take cars off the road? That sort of mechanism will not happen because the market will not allow it. And I think we should really listen to the slogan of the people who marched, the NGOs who marched in Bonn at the climate change conference, and their slogan was, "We need system change, not climate change." They also, and I believe this is absolutely true, advocated that capitalism is completely incompatible with climate justice. Finally, to come to my proposal, I think the Citizens' Assembly have done, like they did on the 8th Amendment, have done an amazing job on climate change. And of their 13 recommendations, the state's action on climate change, their common sense, practical proposals, address many of the areas raised by the Climate Chaos Coalition. I'm reading from Stop Climate Chaos Coalition's statement. Most importantly, their recommendations indicate that the Irish public is prepared to back immediate and strong action to tackle climate change. The government now, from that Citizens' Assembly, has the political mandate to urgently implement new and effective policies and ensure the weaknesses of the National Mitigation Plan are overcome. And my proposal to this Dáil is that we do the same with this Citizens' Assembly 13 recommendations as we did with the 13 recommendations on the 8th Amendment, that we establish a special committee to look at these recommendations, an all-party, cross-party Oireachtas committee that will sit down on special sessions over a number of months and take each recommendation seriously, call in witnesses, examine the witnesses, ask whom would like to come in, and begin to draw up a serious plan that we can deal with. Because too often climate change gets pushed to the last thing we talk about, or the Thursday night graveyard shift, or where we can't talk about the mitigation plan, or we can't talk about it after the reports are published.
Deputy.
So I want to seriously propose that we do set up a special Oireachtas committee to look at the outcome of the Citizens' Assembly on climate chaos.
Thank you, Leslie Carla.